Hey everybody, how you doing? I hope you're well again on this September 15th, 2022 morning. Let's get right to it. Nonprofit news organizations can't publish political hit stories, says the Internal Revenue Service, IRS. Remember the Oaklandside posts that attack Black Oakland election candidates like Oakland mayor candidate Seneca Scott this year and Oakland City Council At-Large seat campaigner Derreck Johnson in 2020? Well, Oakland Readers should be aware that Oaklandside, typically considered an ultra left news publication, is owned by Cityside, which calls itself, quote, nonpartisan, nonprofit media organization committed to building community through local journalism, unquote. Well, the IRS specifically prohibits the kind of character assassination posts against Blacks in Oakland politics that Oaklandside prints and calls, quote, journalism, unquote. In its, quote, the restrictions of political campaign intervention by Section 501c3 tax exempt organizations, that's IRS government website, states that the Internal Revenue Service writes, under Internal Revenue Code, all Section 501c3 organizations are absolutely prohibited from directly or indirectly, indirectly participating in or intervening in any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for elective public office. Contributions to political campaign funds or public statements, of position, verbal or written, made on behalf of the organization in favor of or opposition to any candidate for public office clearly violate the prohibition against political campaign activity. Violating this prohibition may result in denial or revocation of tax exempt status and the imposition of certain excise taxes. Certain activities or expenditures may not be prohibited depending on the facts and circumstances. For example, certain voter education activities, including presenting public forms and publishing voter education guides, voter registration and get out the vote drives, conducted in a nonpartisan manner, do not constitute prohibited political campaign activity. On the other hand, voter education or registration activities with evidence of bias that A, would favor one candidate over the other, B, oppose a candidate in some manner, or C, have the effect of favoring a candidate or group of candidates will constitute prohibited participation or intervention. Now, the Reporters Committee organization has something called a nonprofit news guide that Oaklandside should read, which says, and the organization that owns it, which goes like this: nonprofits that receive tax exempt status under 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code are prohibited from participating in or intervening in, quote, any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office. A tax exempt nonprofit news organization that endorses a candidate for political office, a function routinely performed by news outlets like the Zenny 62 Media, which is for profit, runs the risk of losing its federal tax exempt status. The Internal Revenue Code further prohibits 501c3 tax exempt nonprofits from devoting a substantial part of their activities to attempting to influence legislation. Now let's go to the nonprofit law blog, which is also clear that nonprofit news organizations can't influence readers for or against a particular candidate. This is what the nonprofit law blog reports. Unlike their for-profit counterparts, nonprofit news organizations are limited in the amount of their lobbying activities and prohibited from intervening in political campaigns. The lobbying limitation, however, allows for generous amounts of lobbying, particularly if the organization has made the 501H election, which the owner of Oaklandside has not done, and does not restrict other forms of advocacy. Now, those forms of advocacy have nothing to do with news reporting at all, and are more hosting events, that sort of thing. On the other hand, the political campaign intervention prohibition, well, I might add, and those other forms of advocacy are also point to voter registration and so on. Okay, I'll continue. On the other hand, candidates for public office making campaign contributions in support of such candidates and otherwise using organizational assets to preferentially support certain candidates and or political parties over others. Okay, I'll repeat that. On the other hand, the political campaign intervention prohibition strictly prohibits activities such as endorsing candidates for public office, making campaign contributions in support of such candidates, and otherwise using organizational assets to preferentially support certain candidates and or political parties over others. It's very common for news organizations, this is the nonprofit log blog continuing, to support specific bills or to support specific bills and to publish opinion pieces with a view on such proposed legislation. While a nonprofit news organization need not avoid such activities, they will need to track, okay? They will need to track such activities for reporting purposes and ensure that they have not exceeded the permissible threshold. The law blog continues. News organizations also commonly endorse political candidates and otherwise express views that may influence elections. Nonprofit news organizations may not make such endorsements and must be careful in avoiding partisan political activities that may be considered electioneering. Such problematic activities include publishing pieces on certain wedge issues in a partisan manner, particularly immediately before an election, even if such pieces do not explicitly endorse or even name a political candidate or particular candidate. Most recently, and this is me talking now, not the nonprofit law blog, most recently, Oaklandside tried to tie Oakland mayoral election candidate Ignacio de la Fuente, who I endorsed for mayor of Oakland, with what it called, quote, Oakland coal interests, unquote, as if to imply that the people it named were of bad character. From how many interpret IRS law, what Oaklandside did was illegal. Stay tuned. And I might add that this kind of behavior on the part of that publication has gone on for quite some time without comment, without check. And as I pointed out in previous works, has commonly been directed at African American male political candidates running for office in Oakland. That's got to stop. Subscribe to Zenny62 and bookmark oaklandnewsnowblog.com. Zenny62 Media is a for-profit startup corporation, Delaware corporation. 3 years in good standing. Thank you. That ends this broadcast.